Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week we are continuing with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is going to be the second half of the poem, which is actually the longest half of the poem, so I'll try to keep this video as trimmed down as possible. So just as a recap, so in the first part, we had a Christmas celebration at Camelot with King Arthur and all them, and Sir Gawain, who's King Arthur's nephew, and this green man shows up, and the Green Knight challenges them to a game wherein one of them can take a strike unopposed with an axe to him, and then in a year and a day he gets to do the same to them. And so Sir Gawain takes up the challenge and he cuts off the green man's head, and then of course the green man's fine. He picks up his head and says, all right, a year and a day, you need to come find me. And so then we get Gawain kind of dreading this for a year. He finally leaves. He's going to go find the Green Man's chapel, and he has many adventures along the way, and then he prays for a place to stop because it's Christmas Eve at this point, and he wants to celebrate Christmas Mass somewhere, and he sees a castle, and he enters the castle. The Lord of the castle is very kind and welcoming, and he says, yeah, you can definitely stay here. The Green Chapel is just up the hill, so you can stay here for the next 3 days. There's no rush. And also, let's have a game of our own wherein I'm going to go out hunting, and then you can stay in the house with my wife, and anything that you win while at home, you have to give me, and then everything that I win while out hunting, I have to give you when they come back. So now we're in book 3, or part 3 of the poem, and we see what's going on with them. So I've been using Burton Raffles' translation primarily, but I have been referring to Tolkien's translation as well because his is a little more elevated, a little more elegantly written. This one's much more readable to sort of the everyday reader. I like it a little bit better. It's kind of more immediate. It's a little more gory. It's more quick paced. And this one is very elegantly done, very beautiful. It kind of reads a lot more old-timey, and it kind of has this sort of medieval sweep and gravitas to it. I think ultimately this is sort of the better translation, especially if you're studying it and like using quotes from it, whatever. I think this is probably the better translation, but this is a really accessible translation, and it's also just a lot of fun, and so this is the one that I primarily read. So I'll refer to both of them. So we're going to jump into the summary of part 3. I'm going to try to race through this. I've got my notes here, and then we'll do some quick analysis, and then we'll jump into part 4. So part 3 is the longest section of the poem, so this is going to be kind of excessive, so bear with me here. All right, so the Lord leaves for his hunt the next day with all of his men. Gawain is sort of left alone. And so the lady of the house sneaks into his room before he wakes up and sits on his bed and sort of throws herself at him, saying that she's heard of his virtue and she is his if he wants, basically. There's a cute moment at the beginning where he sort of pretends not to be awake because he's hoping that she just made a mistake and will leave, but you know, she kind of wakes him up. He tells her that to take advantage of her would to be a sin, and he holds off on her advances. She insists that he's the perfect man, and she pretends to be in love with him. And it's important here that we notice that the poet makes it very clear that she's pretending to be in love with him, so we know that there's something going on right away. Gawain is aware that she must be pretending, and so he tries to keep his distance. He does find her attractive, and it's sort of a little bit difficult. And so she then insists that he kiss her, saying that it's only courtesy as they've been talking for so long and they're alone. So he does agree. He says that it's only because of kind of courtly reasons. He's only kissing her as a courtesy to, you know, be like as a thanks for her company kind of thing. And it's very chaste and very mild. And there's also a moment where we get inside her thoughts and we realize that she knows where Gawain is destined to end up when he faces the Green Man. So she knows what's going on, and we get the feeling that she's kind of trying to protect him somehow. So anyways, the Lord returns from a successful hunt, and we get a kind of extended and suitably gory description of him and his men dressing and skinning the deer that they caught. Now at the beginning, we do get a rundown of him hunting the deer, with all of his dogs and all of his hunting men and everything. Very adventurous. He greets Gawain warmly and offers him the game that he caught, because he says, "This is what I caught, so this is all for you." And then Gawain, as they agreed, gives the Lord all he got, by which he means he kisses the Lord, because his wife gave him a kiss, so he gives a kiss to the Lord, saying, "This is everything that I got." So the Lord is pleased by this and asks who Gawain won the prize from. He says, "Oh, who did you get this kiss from?" But Gawain says that's not part of the bargain. He's like, I'm not going to tell you that. The two laugh and they feast together. They have a great time with everybody, and everyone is happy and positive. So then the two men agree to have the same wager the next day. So, okay, all right. We're getting into kind of a fairy tale structure with this section, where you get like the 3 days or the 3 events. That's a very, very common fairy tale trope. And so the next day, the Lord hunts a wild boar. It's a brutal hunt. Many of his people are wounded. Many of his dogs are killed. They are successful, but it's this one boar this time. Intercut between this action, we return to the castle. The lady does come to Gawain's room again and tries to seduce him. She kisses him a second time, though he tries to refuse. She tries to goad him. She says, like, "You're incapable of love." And the whole time he's evading her and sort of keeping a polite distance. And at the end, she kisses him again and then departs. At this point, the Lord returns. He offers Gawain the spoils of his hunt again, which is the one boar, and in return Gawain gives him 2 kisses. And so at the feast later, everyone is singing Christmas songs, and the lady sits next to Gawain and is sort of flirting with him openly. So like, her husband is right there. And he begins to kind of grow frustrated with himself for not putting a stop to this flirtation early on. He's like, "I should have said something, and I need to get out of here." So he tells the Lord, he's like, "I really need to leave. I need to look for the Green Chapel, and I don't want to impinge on your hospitality any longer." But the Lord tries to get him to stay again. He says he's won the game the past 2 nights, so why not try for another day? Gawain agrees reluctantly. The Lord leaves for the hunt really, really early on in the day. And this time the Lord is hunting a fox, and it's a really quick and complex chase. We get inside the fox's head in this section, which is really cool. The fox has like a personality, and we get to see kind of the chase and him eluding the hunters from the point of view of the fox, which is great. And then intercut with this again, we get the lady coming to see Gawain again. She's determined to seduce him. She's dressed in a beautiful cloak adorned with jewels. She's wearing a really slinky, low-cut dress in the front and the back. Gawain is sort of troubled with anxiety about what's going to happen the next day, because the next day is New Year's Day, and that's when he has to face the Green Man again. And so he's a little distracted, but he and the lady talk. They have a good conversation. They connect really well, and he feels like at this point that he only has 2 options. Either he's going to sin and do something with this woman, or he's going to have to rebuff her so rudely that it's going to make him seem like a bore. Like, he doesn't really want to turn her away rudely, but she's coming on so strong that he kind of is worried that the only way he can kind of put a stop to this is by being rude to her. Obviously, he chooses the second option, because that's sort of the lesser of 2 evils, of course. She asks for a gift for him. And he says that he only has his gloves, and they're worn, and they're not a good gift. And so he's like, "I'm sorry, I can't give you a gift. I don't have anything to give you." So then she offers him a gift in exchange. So she tries to give him a really valuable ring at this point. But Gawain says, "It's too valuable. I can't take that from you. Absolutely not." So then she gives him her belt. It's in some translations it's described as a girdle, in others it's a sash, but what it really is it's just like a decorative sash that you tie around your waist, and it's really jeweled and really beautiful. Again, he tries to decline it, but she says that this belt is magical, and anyone who wears it are incapable of being killed. And this interests him, obviously, and so he begrudgingly accepts it. She tells him to keep it a secret from her husband, and then kisses him 3 times. And then she leaves him, her plan having sort of succeeded. So, we kind of get the sense that she wanted him to have this magic belt so that it can protect him from the Green Knight, and now that she's accomplished this task. So at this point, he goes to a priest and confesses his sin so that he may face the Green Knight with a clear conscience. Meanwhile, the fox hunt's successful, but the dogs are really aggressive, and they sort of shred the fox to death. It's really gruesome. And so by the time they're able to like skin the fox and take the fox fur back, it's this sort of ragged, sad thing. So the Lord comes back. Gawain gives the Lord the 3 kisses. that he got from his wife, but he doesn't mention the magic belt. He kind of keeps that a secret. He says his farewells and returns to bed, ready to face the Green Knight the next day. So let's dig into this section. There's a lot here. I could do an entire video series just on this section because there's a lot in it. But there's two things that I kind of wanted to focus on. One thing that I really like about the structure of this one is, for one, we get like the 3-day kind of fairy tale structure, but we also have 2 different hunts going on. We've got the Lord hunting the various game, and then we get sort of the lady hunting Gawain in the castle. And the way that it's sort of intercut between the two, I think works really well, because the hunting scenes are really brutal and visceral, and they're quite gory and bloody, and we get kind of lots of action and movement and everything. And then the internal scenes in the castle are all very kind of light and almost comedic, because, you know, it's a really, really old trope of, you've got sort of the lascivious woman throwing herself at the virtuous man and him sort of trying to crawl away from her while she's coming on to him really hard. One interesting thing to notice here is that the hunts sort of become less successful each day. So the Lord's hunts start out, he's hunting the deer, and he catches a bunch of deer, and it's great. The next day he catches a wild boar, but many of the dogs are killed and a lot of his men are wounded, so it's just one boar. The second day, the third day, you get just sort of one fox, and you don't even get a good fox fur out of it. It's just kind of ragged and unusable. But then in Gawain's bedroom, the seduction scenes sort of become more and more successful each time, because she's able to sort of get inside his head a little bit more, because she appeals not only to his courtly manners, but she appeals to kind of his genuine desires. And we see that this isn't just completely empty seduction. She's not just throwing herself at him because she's pretty, but she's appealing to him as like someone who's in love with him, and she has conversations with him. Many times on the second and third days after the sort of seduction scene in the bedroom, he spends the day with her and her lady in waiting, and they, you know, spend a lot of time together. It says they have a lot of fun, so he does genuinely get along really well with her. And when they're having just sort of friendly get-togethers, and like the lady in waiting's there, so she's like the chaperone, they get along really well. So each night he sort of knows her better and better, and he sort of like gets to know her as a person, not just as like an object. And so the seduction is sort of more and more compelling. And so by the third day, when she's able to convince him to lie to her husband, we can see that she's kind of getting under his skin a bit. He does still maintain his distance. He never does give in, but we do see that they sort of maybe not become friends, but they do sort of connect in a certain way. And so naturally we sort of end up focusing more and more on Gawain's story with the wife, because that story is the one that sort of becomes more compelling, and the hunt with the Lord sort of becomes a little bit of a background story. Whereas at the beginning, the hunt was more exciting, and at the end, Gawain's story is more exciting, which I thought was kind of cool. You get these two branching stories that kind of cross in the middle, and then one kind of takes over. Another thing that I want to mention is that after Gawain keeps the belt, he goes to a priest and confesses his sins. And afterwards, there's a scene where we see that he feels light and happy, and yet he still has the belt. So seeing the priest doesn't convince him to give the belt back. And so this is one of the biggest signs that sort of Gawain has made a mistake at this point, because the wife does tell him to hide it from his husband, and we also think that the belt is magical and it will protect him from the Green Man. So us as readers, we can sort of justify him keeping the belt, because one, you know, she's in on it. She tells him, yeah, this is just for you, it'll protect you. And we kind of want him to live because he's the hero of the story. We want him to survive. We don't want him to die. And so we're kind of okay with him keeping the belt. But then we have this scene where he goes to the priest and confesses, but then he keeps the belt anyways. And this is where we see that he's able to sort of compartmentalize his morals a little bit. He's able to sort of justify lying to someone, which goes against sort of, because he's a very straight-laced, very pious, very honorable person, and his reputation is very important to him. He wants to be seen as sort of virtuous and reliable and everything. And so the fact that he's able to sort of confess to a priest and still keep the belt, but then feel good about it, that's sort of the signal to us that sure, it fits the story and he's going to survive the Green Man when he faces him, and that's great, but there's the risk to his reputation, to his immortal soul, because he's not really as virtuous in that moment as he was for the whole rest of the poem. And so concealing the belt was kind of a necessary evil, but with that added scene of the confession, we learn that like he can sin and then live with the consequences in that kind of moment. There's no guilt there. And that's when we kind of know that there's been a mistake, like he's actually done something wrong. Even though it fits the story and it'll help him survive, he has done something wrong in that moment, and that'll become important later. And I rushed through that section. Part 3 is the longest part in the poem. It's great. There's so much nuance and character interactions. The banter between Gawain and the lady are great. Even the moments where kind of him and the Lord sort of become genuinely like friendly comrades with each other. Like you can tell the Lord respects him. They get along really well. They're just kind of buddies. And it's really wholesome. So you've got sort of this contrast between him and the Lord becoming really good friends, and then him and the lady sort of becoming more tense and messy. It's a great story. I love it so much. So we're going to move on to part 4. This is the finale to the whole poem, and then we'll get into that. So we finally reach New Year's Day, and the beginning of this section is really interesting because it starts with this sort of epic let there be light sort of moment. It's sort of like the sunrise of New Year's Day is there's something big that's happening. There's something that's going to change. And then we also get some sort of apocalyptic imagery because there's a really awful winter storm that sort of descends on the area, and it's very kind of ominous. And so Gawain awakes. He's dreading the day. He gets dressed. We get a description of him putting all of his clothes and armor on. Everything is beautiful and flawless. And he wears the lady's magic belt, but he wears it kind of under his armor, so it's concealed. And he offers prayers of reward and thanks to his host as he departs. He doesn't like talk to them directly, but it's sort of like as he's walking away, he looks back at the castle and everything. He's going with a guide who's going to show him where the Green Man's chapel is, and the guide leads him up the mountain, and along the way he sort of begs Gawain to reconsider. He says the Green Man is dangerous, he says he's evil, and he says, you need to stay away from him. And he even says, if you want, you can run away and hide. I will lie to everyone. I'll tell them that you died, or I'll make an excuse for you so you can sort of stay alive and stay away from the Green Man. And Gawain refuses this. He says that his honor's at stake. He has to face the Green Man as he agreed. He can't refuse, even if it means he gets to live. And so he finds the Green Chapel, and it's a very kind of, it's called a chapel, but it's sort of this very pagan sort of place. It's like a mound in the middle of a clearing in the woods. It's kind of overgrown with moss, and it looks sort of just like a cave. It doesn't seem to be sort of churchy in any way. There's no religious iconography. And so at this point he sees this and he really despairs that the Green Man is sort of a servant of the devil, and he really starts to become worried. So he calls out, and he hears this horrible noise coming from somewhere, and he looks up, and it's the Green Man who has this huge battle axe, and he's sharpening it on a grindstone, so it's very ominous. And so the Green Man comes down to join him, and Gawain sort of removes his helmet, he sits down, he lowers his head after the Green Man sort of reminds him of his oath. He says, you're here, you cut off my head, so now it's my turn, I get to cut off your head. And Gawain sort of says, okay, fine, let's do this. The Green Man raises his axe and makes as if to bring it down, but Gawain flinches, and the Green Man sort of mocks him good-humoredly at this point. And, he says, oh, you flinched, kind of thing. He's sort of teasing him. And so Gawain says, nope, I'm not going to flinch again. Do it quickly, and I promise I won't move. And so the Green Man hefts the axe again, and he brings it down, but not on Gawain's neck. It's sort of off to the side a bit. And so he feels like a whoosh of air but nothing happens. The Green Man sort of teases him again, and so Gawain's sort of getting frustrated at this point. He tells him to get it over with. He even asks the Green Man if he's having second thoughts. You know, he sort of mocks him back. And so for the final time, the Green Man raises the axe and he brings it down, but it's just a little bit off, and it just cuts Gawain's neck. It sort of slices him, and he does bleed, but it just sort of grazes his neck. It's not a fatal blow. So at this point, Gawain thinks that he's missed. And so he puts on his helmet really quick, he stands up, he pulls out his sword and holds the Green Man at sword point and says, "That's it, that was your one strike, you can't do anything else, you can't kill me, and I'll defend myself if you try," kind of thing. And the Green Man is really cheerful at this. He sort of laughs, he says, "Nope, Gawain, you're not in any danger, that was my one strike, you're good." And so then the Green Knight sort of reveals what's going on. And so he reveals that he is the Lord of the Castle, disguised as a Green Man. He explains that the first swing, where he was just a little bit off, was for kissing his wife, but because Gawain was an honorable man and gave the kisses back to the Lord, he only got a puff of air rather than a blade. So he says, if you had kissed my wife and not told me anything about it, that strike would have killed you. But he was very respectful, he treated his wife well. He then explains that the second blow, where he cut his neck, was because he kept the magic belt and didn't tell the Lord about it. He then explains that him and his wife were in on this. They were both sort of testing him, and it was a test of his honor. And he then explains, he says that he admires that Gawain never broke his word for lust for his wife or greed at the richness of the belt. He doesn't want to keep it because, you know, it's valuable and he can sell it and make money, but he did conceal the belt because of fear for his own life. Gawain feels shame for this, and he declares that cowardice and greed destroys chivalry. He throws the belt at the Green Man, and declares that, you know, fear of the impending axe turned him into a coward, and he feels like he's forever tainted by this, and he's never going to get over it. He feels really awful about lying to the Lord. But the Green Man laughs. He's a very positive, likable character in this moment, and he reassures him that the damage has been undone. He's returned the belt. He says Gawain is a good man who's always been virtuous, and that, you know, if there was any sin, he's been forgiven for it because, you know, no harm has been done, basically, is what he says. He then gives the belt back to Gawain and says he can keep it and wear it as a sign of his virtue. And then he invites him back to the castle with him. He says they can feast and celebrate, and he can spend time with him and his wife now that all the kind of pretense is gone, and they can just be friends, and there's no hard feelings whatsoever. And so Gawain goes on a bit of a rant at this point. The context of this is sort of interesting because it could be seen as sort of a misogynistic rant, but it could also be seen as a rant against sort of the weakness of men and how pathetic they are when they're, when they encounter a beautiful woman. So there's a couple different ways to read this. Some people read it as he's sort of hating women and blaming them for all of men's problems, and other people read it and say that he's just saying that men are weak and women are kind of their one weakness. And so it's kind of interesting, but he cites some sort of, biblical women who led holy men astray. He mentions like Delilah, who led to Samson's death, and he mentions Bathsheba, who was involved with King David. So he kind of has this little rant, and then he feels better after, and he thanks the Green Man for the belt and says that he'll wear it, but he won't wear it sort of proudly because it's beautiful or well made, but he's going to wear it as a reminder to himself of his sin and weakness, because he feels like he's just he made a mistake. He genuinely feels regret for it, and he feels like there's nothing he can do to make that better. So then he asks the Green Man what his name is, and the Green Man, of course, is the Lord, and he says his name is Lord Bertilak. Now, the translation by Raffle says that his name is Bercilak, Bercilak. Tolkien's translation says Bertilak with a T, and I think Bertilak makes more sense, but again, the K and T sound, when you're dealing with Middle English, it might have been one letter at one point, and then it was changed over the years to be a different sound because you've got the K and the T. And so I'm going to just refer to him as Bertilak because I like Tolkien's version better, but there is kind of different ways to name it. It's kind of like other Arthurian characters who have sort of different spellings of their name. So Lord Bertilac reveals that he was sent to test Gawain by Morgana Le Fay, the famous sister-in-law to Arthur and one-time lover of Merlin. And also, since Gawain is Arthur's nephew, that makes Morgana Gawain's aunt. She's a sorceress, so he explains she was able to create the illusion of him getting his head chopped off and this, like the talking severed head that frightened everyone. He explains that she meant it to sort of scare the knights and especially scare Queen Guinevere because, you know, Morgan Le Fay doesn't really like Guinevere that much. And at this point, he says there's no hard feelings. He invites Gawain back to his castle, and it's implied that Morgan is at that castle. So Morgana Le Fay is at the castle. He's like, you can come to the castle. He's like, my men really like you. They're looking forward to feasting with you again. But Gawain sort of declines politely at this point. The two embrace and they part ways as friends. At this point, Gawain encounters many more adventures on his way home. But of course, the poet brushes this all aside again. He says, oh yeah, there's so much stuff that he did, and maybe someday I'll be able to tell that story, but not right now anyways. And you're like, what? So he wears the green belt back to Camelot. This time he's wearing it pretty openly, like a sash. And everyone is really overjoyed to see him back, to see him alive. He tells them everything, including his folly with the belt and the wife, and he says that he's sort of been tainted by this and he's a coward, and you know, he's going to wear this belt forever to tell everyone that he's sort of not a virtuous person like he thought he was. Arthur, of course, says that's silly, and he says that every knight in Camelot is now going to wear a green sash in solidarity with Gawain. So even though he's wearing it so that everyone will sort of single him out and say, oh, you know, that must be a symbol of something, he's saying every knight's going to wear this green sash. So the meaning of it is sort of diluted, because instead of it being a symbol of Gawain's sin, it's just going to be something that everyone wears to remind them all to be good. But in doing so, it sort of dilutes the shame in making him stand out. The story ends happily with a Latin line that says, shame to him who finds evil here, which is sort of interesting. So, you know, normally you end it with sort of, you know, and they lived happily ever after, but it's basically kind of like, you know, don't you dare ruin this happy ending because it's good and everything's fine. It ends with sort of a reference to Jesus, and, you know, says that, you know, Arthur was sort of a symbol of kingly divine goodness, and you know, the reputation of the Round Table wasn't diminished in any way. So that is part 4, and that is the end of the poem. So digging into part 4 a little bit, the reveal of Morgan Le Fay is pretty fantastic, but it does bring to mind a question. Do you think her motives were evil or noble? So in many Arthur stories, she's often written as an antagonist, but yet we see that Lord Bertilac is a good guy and he bears no ill will towards Gawain. And so he's working for Morgan Le Fay, and so the question is sort of, is he part of a nefarious plot, or was this, as he said, a test of honor that he kind of wanted to end well? Now, maybe there's better scholars out there that can answer this more definitively. I know there's a lot of cultural context as well. Morgan Le Fay is a really interesting character, and so there's a lot there. So I'll leave that kind of up to you. One of the articles in one of the books here talks about how the plot doesn't really hold up when you dig into it, because, you know, what lord would go out with all of his men and leave his wife behind with a stranger who may or may not take advantage of her? But we do see that because the Green Man sort of has the ability to shapeshift, and he's unhurt by an axe taking off his head because of Morgan's magic. Maybe it's implied that the wife is thus, you know, magically protected. Maybe the belt that she has really is magical, and so if he did decide to take advantage of her, the belt would protect her. But I don't know. This is an interesting story, and so it's not really clear whether or not this was sort of an evil plot that Gawain foiled by being a good guy, or if this was sort of a test to sort of reinforce the goodness and virtue of the Knights of the Round Table. So that's kind of an interesting question, and I'll leave that up to you to muse over. We don't get a lot of insight into Morgana's motivations. So it's hard to say either way, but overall this is a great poem, and I love digging into these kinds of discussions. There's long, lengthy articles talking about minute elements of this and bringing in historical and cultural backgrounds. And so there's a lot of reading you can do about this poem if you want to kind of dig into it deeper. But moving into sort of just overall conclusions for the whole poem, it's been a long time since I've read it last, and so it's nice to revisit it. So my final questions to you, dear viewer, is what was your favorite section of the 4 parts? And also, who was your favorite character? I have a hard time finding a favorite character, but mine has to be sort of the Green Man / Lord Bertilac, because he's so delightful. He's like this scary antagonist, but he's such a cheerful, positive person, and he's got this kind of Jack Nicholson's Joker sort of energy about him at first before you sort of reveal what's going on, because he seems to be just sort of happy and overjoyed, even though he's gonna, cut Gawain's head off ultimately. And I think he's just a great character. But tell me in the comments who your favorite character is. I also really love the Lord's wife. She's great. But let me know. If you want to see a film adaptation of this story, there are a couple. There is one, it's a TV movie from like the early 90s. It's pretty accurate to the poem, so if you want sort of a fairly accurate rundown of the story, this is a good one. Now the effects are a little ropey. It's a little like hokey looking, but the acting is good, the atmosphere is good, and if you just sort of get into it, you're fine. It's kind of like when you're watching classic Doctor Who serials. The effects are bad, but the story's good, and so you can kind of forgive the plastic monsters and just sort of get into the writing, and that's it. There is also a more recent movie that I mentioned before. This one stars Dev Patel, and it cuts out certain parts of the poem, but it's much more about sort of these dreamy visuals. It's got this kind of nightmare quality to it. It's very much digging into sort of human nature and the darkness kind of at the heart of everyone, and the conflicted nature of Gawain as a knight. I would also love to see like a novel adaptation of this. I don't know if that exists. Maybe it does. If it does, let me know about it. But I'd love to see a story revisiting this from the wife's perspective, from her point of view, because she's aware of this and she's sort of working with her husband to sort of play this trick on Gawain, but also to test him. And I'd love to see a version of the story from her point of view, especially if we get one where she's sort of conflicted because she knows that he's heading to his death and she's trying to protect him, but she's also trying to keep up with her husband's wishes. I don't know. I just think there's some interesting character stuff there. There's a lot of really messy character work in this that I think is really cool. So anyways, I think that'd be great. If you're an author, just an idea, you can steal that idea if you want. I'd love to read it, so let us know. With that said, I do also want to say, if you're interested in sort of Middle English, medieval King Arthur stuff, there's a couple other sources you can get into. There is Geoffrey Chaucer, especially his big Canterbury Tales. It's like a collection of poems. It's in Middle English. You can kind of read it, but there are translations into modern English that you can read. One that I particularly love is the Tale of Sir Topaz, or Sir Topus as he's called. And it's another Arthurian retelling, but it's the one that like Chaucer's character in the story tells. So you've got all these other characters and they tell their stories and they're all funny or interesting. You've got the Knight's Tale and the Wife of Bath's Tale and all that stuff. And then Chaucer himself is a character and they're like, well, you need to tell a story now. And he says, okay, I've got this one. And it's this ridiculous story of this like goofball knight. And it's like Looney Tunes levels of ridiculous. And he basically just sort of just drives around on his horse, just sounding important and not really doing anything. And so eventually the innkeeper stops him and says, oh my God, this is the worst story ever. I'm sorry I asked. Stop talking, we'll go to the next person. And it's hysterical. Another really good one is Sir Thomas Malory's Le Mort d'Arthur, and I probably pronounced that wrong. This is a huge collection. Now, this was written at the end of the 15th century, so it is still Middle English, but it was written after Chaucer, and so It's much closer to early modern English. A lot of editions that you can find are, all they do is just update the spelling, but they didn't really need to translate it, because Middle English is very much sort of a different language, but it's a close enough language to modern English that we can sort of read it. The Middle English of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a very odd dialect, so that one is a much harder text to read. With this one, all you have to really do is fix the spelling of a few words and modernize the spelling, and you can read it pretty easily. This one is much closer to early modern English, kind of like Shakespeare. Shakespeare is sort of end of the 1500s, beginning of 1600s, and so this is right at the end of the 1400s. So this is like 90-ish years before Shakespeare. And so it's closer to early modern English, so you can read it. There are also translations where they sort of modernize the syntax and the word choice a little bit more, but if you find one that's just sort of modern spelling, but the original text, you can still read it pretty easily. And this one is sort of a huge collection of Arthurian stories. He wrote this in prison, kind of at the end of his life, but it's huge. And there's some stories that it kind of rushes through, but there's others that he really gets into. This is where you get like a good rundown of like Tristan and Isolde, you know, the story of King Arthur's birth and his adventures and the story of his death with Mordred and all that. So this is another really great Arthurian text. I don't know, I really like it. It's a little bit difficult to read in some places because he sort of skips ahead, because he assumes that the people reading it already knew the stories. So he's like, oh, well, you know, that thing that you already knew. And if you're completely new to King Arthur, there's some moments where you're kind of like, wait, what is that? So if you can find one that maybe has like footnotes or explanations that kind of give some context, that's good. But this is still a really complete version of kind of the King Arthur story that we got written down. Before this, there was lots of King Arthur stuff, but it was sort of in fragments and sort of oral history. Some of it was written down, but it wasn't sort of collected. And then after this, of course, there's other more modern editions. One really famous one is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. That was written in the 50s, and it sort of takes the sweep of this story and tells sort of Arthur's story, you know, in a more cohesive way. But it also throws in some sort of modern anachronisms. He like, Merlin mentions radio and stuff. The Disney version of The Sword and the Stone is adapted straight from the Sword and the Stone book from The Once and Future King. And it's interesting, when you read the book, it's funny how much they didn't change for the Disney version. Like, it's pretty accurate. It kind of has that sort of Disney style. But then, of course, later books get progressively darker and darker as things start to fall apart. So if you're interested in King Arthur, there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of different versions of the story. There's also a ton of great movies. The movie Excalibur from the 80s is a classic of like 80s epic fantasy, and it's fantastic. And you need to watch it because it's a good movie. There's another version from later on, and it's Sam Neill as Merlin, and I cannot remember what it's called. I'll put it on the screen because when I'm editing this, I'll be able to look it up. But that one's also really good. It's also got a great cast, and it's kind of goofy, but it's really, really interesting. So anyways, with that said, I'll let you go. This week is sort of, there's a bunch of holidays here. We've got Hanukkah starting up. We've got Christmas on Wednesday. And then we've got Kwanzaa starting later on in the week. So happy holidays, and I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.